Many major universities in Europe today were established hundreds of years in the past during the Middle Ages. The universities of Paris, Oxford, and Bologna are just some of them, and with them came new ways of thinking, including how men regarded themselves as men and intellectuals. After many years of relatively little interest in academics and learning, there was an eventual revival during the late 12th century, and it was during this time that universities began coming into existence. However, these universities were not born in a single night, but rather gradually grew from groups of masters who had personally taken renewed interest in the now resurfacing ancient ideas of the Greeks and Romans. These ideas led men to question their identities not just as men, but as the intellectual elite. Through domination of each other, men in universities were able to express their masculinity and set themselves apart from women and common men. During the 9th and 10th centuries, Europeans simply had no real interest or need for universities or institutional learning at the time. The average person in medieval Europe was a farmer, and academics were essentially not useful to the average European during this time. It usually did not lead to having a higher income, and in general was just not needed. It was also very expensive, as even simple books were something that the average person could not afford. Almost any practice of academics at this time was purely because of interest, not to gain increased income or a better position. The primary focus during this time was towards invasions, as Western Europe was besieged from all sides during the 9th and 10th centuries. The Muslims in Italy, the Hungarians to the east, and arguably the most troublesome, the Vikings, who invaded as far south as Spain. During this time, the church was the only institution that had any interest in education and learning. In fact, all the way up to the early 1100s, a large percentage of all education was practiced in monasteries. So how did this change? It was in the early 12th century that Western Europe began to experience a period of economic recovery and increased commerce, once the looming threat of numerous invasions had diminished. Increased interest in Greek and Roman ideas, which had long been forgotten in Europe, was experiencing an influx of knowledge, partially from Italy and Sicily, but also through the Arab scholars inhabiting Spain. The works of Greek philosophers like Aristotle, as well as Roman law, were rediscovered with a renewed interest, which helped spur the increase in academic practice outside of monasteries. Nations in Europe were also in increased communication and commerce with one another, as well as with nations outside of Europe, so there was an increased need for intellectuals to fill the place as administrators and officials. This created a need, or better yet, a purpose to formal education that hadn't existed before monastic scholarship. Medieval universities did not look like present-day universities when they were first established. During the 10th century, universities were built of groups of men and were not tied to specific institutions or locations. Before universities were ever established, there were already groups of masters who would often travel to numerous schools throughout Europe. Oftentimes, the location of where these universities would later be formally established were often already set up by the local bishops near a cathedral or monastery, where masters and students would meet to lecture and debate, most of the time about theology. Universities were also not born suddenly, and there are no fixed dates for when they were established. The University of Palencia in Spain and the University of Naples could be considered as exceptions to this, as they were both given official dates of establishment, Palencia by Alfonso VII of Castile sometime between 1212 to 1214, and Naples in 1224 by Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. However, both of these places had already been practicing academics long before this, and these dates were more of a validation or confirmation by these monarchs. When universities had been established, many of them practiced different academics, which contributed to constant movement of scholars between schools in order to search for the learning they desired. The universities of Bologna and Padua originally focused on law, specifically Roman law. The University of Salerno and many other southern European universities practiced medicine. The University of Paris was one of the most important universities of its time, as it was the first school that focused on theology and philosophy. Not only that, but many other universities used the University of Paris as a model for their educational structures and constitutions. It was also one of the first universities to have the idea of a college with simple room and board for students. Some of the biggest changes that came from the rise of universities was how it affected men and women. While in monasticism, education was more or less open to both genders, though typically men and women were educated separately, education in universities were the domain of men. Women could be educated in universities, but their views were unimportant in the new male-dominated universities of Europe. The 12th century renewal in old knowledge is considered by some historians to be a 12th century Renaissance. With this Renaissance, the old focus of Latin grammar and monastic schools in the 11th century shifted towards dialectic, or the study of reasoning skills and logic. In Paris especially, the dialectic method was often used in conjunction with theology. Peter Abelard was one of the first well-known scholars to try and analyze the scriptures using logic and reason. This shift in trying to analyze the scriptures was not welcomed by the church and was opposed by many clergymen. However, dialectic became the norm throughout universities in Europe and became the basis for medieval education. According to Carus, the intellectual method of universities, especially in the arts, was based almost entirely on the study of logic, and disputation was the pedagogical technique deemed most suited to its practice. Carus also goes on to state that the disputational process was inherently competitive, which led universities to adopt similar notions of masculinity to that of the knights. The knights used violence to dominate other men, through the use of actual combat, as well as mock fights and jousts. For knights, according to Carus, violence was the fundamental measure of a man because it was a way of exerting dominance over men. Through violence, men proved their superior masculinity by besting other men. Men in universities also attempted to dominate other men violently. However, in the words of Carus, the violence was metaphorical, using words as weapons. These men would debate with each other to prove their points, but also to prove themselves superior intellectually. This new educational system of debate, which was between both masters and students, created a new ideal masculine model for the educated. The better you were at using logic and using disputation to prove your points, the more you were respected, and the more you were respected by fellow intellectuals, the more people listened to your words and ideas. This was very important to men in universities, as proving one's intellectual superiority could only be validated by other individuals. This meant that one's masculinity could only be proven with the recognition of other men. This made students more attracted to specific teachers than the names of the universities themselves. According to Daly, every teacher knows that where there is a great deal of discussion, there is at least a great deal of interest, and where one has interest, one has many students. The more the interest grows, the more the student body grows. In those days, the presence of a famous master meant a famous school. Peter Abelard is a perfect example of this. Using his former master, William of Champeaux, as essentially a stepping stool, Abelard quickly set himself against his former master's arguments, which set himself as an independent but also equal opponent, which quickly changed his status from pupil to master, which increased his renown, allowing him to gain his own student body. Carus attests to this as well, as she states that students in disputing with their masters could move from a more subordinate and differential position to claim the full masculine privilege of speech. This relationship of student and master was interchangeable, and oftentimes students, like Peter Abelard, would become masters and vice versa. This was all dependent on who was viewed to have the most knowledge and skill in disputation, and this ideal of masculinity persisted in universities well into the 20th century and influenced education in Europe extensively. Overall, the rise of universities in the Middle Ages had a profound effect on the future of Europe. The revival of old knowledge, fueled by the use of dialectic, would become the basis of education in Europe for hundreds of years, as well as leading to the establishment of the first and most prominent universities in Western Europe. This 12th century Renaissance can be considered the first step to the modern universities we know today, and an important phase in history that led Europe out of the Middle Ages.